So the father divided the property between them. It wasn't long before the younger son packed his bags and left for a distant country. There, undisciplined and dissipated, he wasted everything he had. After he had gone through all his money, there was a bad famine all through that country, and he began to hurt. He signed on with a citizen there who assigned him to his fields to slop the pigs. He was so hungry he would have eaten the corn cobs in the pig slop, but no one would give him any. That brought him to his senses. He said, all those farmhands working for my father sit down to 3 meals a day, and here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me as a hired hand. He got right up and went home to his father. When he was still a long way off, his father saw him. His heart pounding, he ran out, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started his speech. Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again. But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to the servants, quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. We are going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive, given up for lost and now found. And they begin to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on. He told him, your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef, because he has him home safe and sound. The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join in. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, look how many years I've stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours, who has thrown away your money on whores, shows up and you go all out with a feast. The father said, son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time, and we had to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. He was lost, and he's found. In traditional Middle Eastern culture, for a younger son to ask for his inheritance while his father was alive was the same as saying, Dad, I'm just really anxious for you to hurry up and die. I just want to live as if you were already dead. The younger son in this story shames his father and disgraces the family. But things don't go so well for him, and he ends up tending pigs. Now, for the Jewish of that day, that was like falling into the cesspool of all cesspools. Jews who touched pigs were considered 4 times as unclean as someone who visited a prostitute. That's how bad it was considered. Finally, he comes to his senses, this young son, and he came to himself. That's what the King James Version says. He came to himself. I love that phrase because it's kind of like that epiphany. It's like, oh. And we need those kinds of revelations at times to move us into another area of our journey. So he comes to himself, and he heads home in shame and disgrace. But his father sees him coming, and he runs toward him. The Greek word that it uses there for running is what they use for athletic games. So his father actually sprinted. He sprinted out to see his son. So Dad doesn't tap his foot. He doesn't have his arms crossed and have a scowl on his face. He doesn't wait up on the porch waiting for this disgrace of a child to show up. He runs and throws himself on his son. The son who is filthy and disheveled, probably pretty stinky, And he doesn't even wait for the boy to finish his speech. He says, he cuts him off and he cries, "You're my son and you're home." Then the unimaginable happens. He kisses him in the midst of all of that filth. And he reinstates the boy's position in the family. He takes those dirty, smelly clothes off of him. He cleans him up, gives him a signet ring, a robe, and shoes. He's my son, and he's home at last. The younger son probably never truly knew how good and redeeming his father was before leaving home. But he did know that he was a good master, okay? Even with that limited perspective of a master, it was powerful enough to invite him back in his despair, invite him back home after he had so desperately failed. But he came back with the idea, I'm going to serve a master and be just like one of the hired hands. But Jesus didn't tell this story so that we could hear about a good master. He told the story so that we could hear about a good father. Even a good master can be slaved for, but slavery is never a good father's wish for his children. While many of us know God as a good master and we slave to earn his favor at times, that is never the good father's intention for us. If our revelation of God as a good master does not mature to one of him as a good father, we may find ourselves living just like the prodigal, enslaved either to the world or to religion. Henry Nouwen wrote a book about this story called The Return of the Prodigal Son. Here's a quote from his book as he relates himself to the younger son. He says, "Over and over again I have left home. I have fled the hands of blessing and run to faraway places searching for love. This is the greatest tragedy of my life and the lives of so many I meet on my journey. Somehow I have become deaf to the voice that calls me the beloved. There are many other voices. The dark voices of my surrounding world try to persuade me that I am no good and that I can only become good by earning my goodness through making it up the ladder of success." The moment the younger son truly saw his father's nature is the moment he really received his true inheritance. And it's the same for us. The moment we truly see Jesus, our God, as the good, loving Father, that's the moment we are set free and empowered to be his sons and daughters. That revelation, his sovereign love, his goodness, and our identity in him is our inheritance. And it's an inheritance that's accompanied by trust and self-control and safety and love and goodness and security in him. The power of that inheritance can actually transform the way we relate to the world we live in and the people that we come in contact with on our journey. Our inheritance invites us into an intimacy with him that fulfills our deepest needs. And then, of course, in the story, we have the older son. And we have quite a different picture here. The older son's frustrated interaction with his dad reveals that, just like his younger brother, he truly didn't know his father's love nature either. He slaved for his father in a work-based understanding of that relationship. When we slave and try harder and try harder and try harder, we cannot celebrate mercy or grace in our own lives, much less give it to other people that we come in contact with. Because he didn't truly know his dad's heart, he then also couldn't truly know who he was. The father never condemned the older son. He condemned himself. He was his own judge, a slave cut off from intimacy, working hard, but with a pretty bad attitude. Could I ask you this question? Is it possible that much of the world sees the church or organized religion as the older brother? Could it be that they see us as slaving away for a father who may not even be very good, while also seeing us wagging our fingers in judgment and condemnation at a lost, hurting, lonely, broken, confused world? Just think what's going on in our society today. It has all become about freedom from religion. And that's the clarion call that's being out there these days. Isn't that kind of the opposite effect that we're supposed to have on the world? Aren't they supposed to be drawn to us to feel that love, to recognize answers to their questions and get clarity for their confusion? Isn't that what's supposed to happen? Oh, if it were only so. In my counseling over the years, I've talked to many, many people who have grown up in the church, Pentecostal, denominational, even in very dedicated home environments. But many of them have been so disillusioned by their experiences with the human representation of who God is that they've completely turned their backs on all of it. Some now claim to be spiritual but not religious. Others make no claim to anything at all. One recently told me, he says, all religion is a scam. Now that's somebody who's been pretty hurt. Where have we as individuals and the church gone so wrong? Could it be that because many of us ourselves have not clearly seen or come face to face with the truly transforming, empowering love of a good father? Could it be that we ourselves are still confused and unsure about who he is and who we are? Yes, we believe in receiving the Holy Ghost, just like they did in the book of Acts, right? But I also believe that we can greatly limit the work of the Spirit in our lives and our hearts when we don't do our part in giving our woundedness, our hurts, our angers, our fears, offenses to him to cleanse them. When we are still acting out those wounds and hurts against ourselves and other people in relationships, we aren't ready or able to surrender them at that point. Maybe that's why people often wait till they get to that desperate place, that aha, that they're willing to do whatever it takes to finally hear what God has been trying to say to them for a long time. That's what happened to me, and I bet there are others with stories like that too. But if we haven't gotten to that place and are like the older brother, then we're still trying to work our way into acceptance and reward. The older brother had stayed with his father and in his house, but the truth is he was just as lost as his younger brother. Neither of those brothers knew their father and his true heart and his goodness. Neither of them knew how to relate to their father well or knew their own true identity. The younger son, through his experience, his devastation, came face to face with that, and he found a completely transformed life in the relationship with his father when he was received back into the home the way that he was. The older son, however, was so blinded by his perspective, his respectability and his own sense of morality, that he did not see that. Think about this with me for a minute. Ask yourself the question, could I perhaps at times even be the older brother myself? Here are 3 signs that that might be the case. First, when I hold on to my anger rather than process it, I am the older brother. He's angry at what his younger brother has done in squandering the money. He shamed and embarrassed the family. He caused him, the older brother, more work because the younger one left and left the older one to do all the work. But he doesn't own his anger. He doesn't wrestle with it. He doesn't bring it humbly to his father. And sometimes we also stuff our anger until we explode. And sometimes we take out our anger on others. And sometimes we turn the anger so strongly inward that we swallow so much of it that it turns into depression or ulcers or insomnia or tension headaches. A second sign that I am the older brother is when I find myself grumbling and complaining a lot. The older brother says to his father, "This son of yours." He doesn't even say, "It's my brother." He is condescending and proud and fault-finding. He could instead process his sadness and his disappointment over his younger brother, but all we see in this parable is that he's resentful and angry. When we find ourselves discontent and grumpy, envying others, it is a sign that we are not in the restored younger brother's position of humility, but we are caught up in the pride of the older brother. A third sign that I am the older brother is when I have a hard time letting go of offenses. When that is true, forgiveness is not in the picture. Unforgiveness turns to resentment, which turns to bitterness. Hebrews 12:15 gives us this warning, looking diligently lest any man fall of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Notice it says many. Keeping people on the hook for what they have done to me is the older brother position. The truth is that the organized church can be full of both brothers. The younger sons who run away every time God or someone else doesn't meet their expectations. We call them the prodigals or the backslidden. And the older brothers who are judgmental, complaining, and critical. We call them the saints or the ain'ts, I'm not sure which. You see, each reacts differently, but the truth is neither of them has a full revelation of who their father truly is. Both brothers in our parable, and yea, verily, even sometimes ourselves in our lives today, saw their father as controlling and demanding, a good master that they had to try to slave for. They just chose to respond to it in different ways. One of them ran away outwardly, but the other one ran away inwardly. And aren't those responses still typical ones today? We run away or we hunker down with a bad attitude. Jesus didn't come to defend the gospel. He came to reveal it. When we take our eyes off of Jesus and his perfect love for us, we forget why we are really here. We become more interested in defending a set of principles than revealing love and goodness. Jesus lived miraculously, he died selflessly, and he rose powerfully so that we might be restored back into our place in the family as his sons and daughters. So we might have full access to our inheritance, our true inheritance, that love nature of our Father and intimacy with him. If we don't know Jesus for who he really is, if we have those colored glasses, like the fellas did in our zebra fable that I talked about before, we don't see him clearly, then we're forced to live in the insecurity of slavery, under the weight of need, and we are compelled to defend the gospel rather than live it and reveal it to other people. If we don't know him for who he truly is, then, like the older brother, we will find ourselves in direct opposition to him. And you know what that looks like? Judgment. We judge when we were intended to love. As I talk about the older brother and the younger brother, I see them both living within the framework of toxic or unhealthy shame. I want to talk about that for just a bit tonight. This is actually something I've been teaching for many years, the whole idea of a grace-based life as opposed to a shame-based way of living. But I've not had this wider framework to put it into that I have since I've discovered the books I mentioned to you and this whole perspective. In other words, I've had the perspective of exactly how it fits into I've not had the perspective of exactly how it fits into our view of who God actually is. I've taught it from the perspective of how we see ourselves and how we learn to see ourselves, and that's for sure. But I'm discovering with all of this that it's so much broader than that. And it, again, ultimately boils down to our perspective of God and who he is. But I can see it now more clearly how it all fits together. So let's take a look. Grace is God's system. Grace is the undeserved acceptance and love that we receive from a loving, good God. The one he came to show us so clearly when he walked on the earth in human form. Under grace, when our behavior is wrong, we can recognize it and correct it. We can say, I made a mistake, I can do something different, I can change my behavior. That's the message of grace. With grace, our identity is secure and unchanging, even though our behavior might not be what it should be or could be. In other words, I made a mistake, but I'm still loved. Grace is also what we're supposed to give others and receive back from them in our relationships. Grace gives us the freedom and the incentive to change our behavior because love empowers and it transforms, remember? Real love doesn't demand or control or diminish or reject. But shame, that's the broken world system. Shame says we have to earn acceptance and approval by our behavior. You have to perform the way I think you should, or I won't love you, I will reject you. It's the system that says God is controlling and demanding, and you have to please him. In this system, when our behavior is wrong, according to whoever's doing the judging of right and wrong at that point, we see ourself as wrong and hopeless. So it becomes not I made a mistake, but it becomes I am a mistake. And it becomes about our identity or our character. Therefore, it's hopeless. There's nothing I can do about it. Lewis Smedes wrote this. He says, shame is heavy, grace is light. Shame and grace are the two counterparts in the human spirit. Shame depresses, but grace lifts. Shame is like gravity, a psychic force that pulls us down. Grace is like levitation, a spiritual force that defies gravity. Jeff Van Vonderen wrote this. He says, shame is a cancer of the heart and of the mind that relentlessly and unmercifully tears away at people and destroys their relationships. It is the painful feeling of being bad as a person, a sense of being seen in a diminished, devalued way, and it tells you that you are deficient, inadequate, and unworthy. Here are some of the statements that people typically make out loud or to themselves when they are dealing with unhealthy shame. I sometimes feel like I'm a fake. I feel that if people who admire me really knew who I was, then they might have contempt for me. I feel inadequate. I seldom feel like I am up to what is expected to me. I just can't measure up. When I look inside, I rarely feel any joy at what I am. I'll never be acceptable. I feel inferior to the really good people that I know. I feel as if God must be disgusted with me. Those are some of the things that we tell ourselves. One of the things I also notice in the years of teaching about this is when I start talking about it, it gets very quiet. Brother Chester Wright in Maryland said this: unresolved shame is the most debilitating spiritual condition with which we contend today. It is the root of almost all Christian inconsistency. Giving up hope of being any different drives more people to backslide than temptation or sin. So, both brothers in our parable were living within a shame-based understanding of their father and life itself. They both saw their dad as a controlling master, not a good father. And they each reacted to what they perceived as control in their different ways. Again, just as we do today. As human beings, we have three basic needs. Number one, we need to be convinced that we are loved and accepted without strings. We have to realize that we don't have to behave or refrain from behaving in a certain way to get love and acceptance. And we need to know that love and acceptance won't be withdrawn from us because of a lack of performance or imperfect performance. In other words, that unconditional love and acceptance. Number two, we need to be convinced that we are capable, valuable, important, special, and worthy. Unconditional love and acceptance help children grow into adults who recognize the imprint of God on their soul and the great potential that brings into their hearts and into their lives. It doesn't convey a sense of arrogance at all, but it should convey a sense of humility at what we've been given, and that what we have been given we can use to serve other people. Number three, we need to be convinced that we are not alone. There's two different aspects to that. Number one, we need to know that we aren't the only ones who feel the way that we are. You know, the enemy says, you're the only one who ever felt that way. Don't you dare tell anybody else, they won't understand. And number two, a part of that, we also need to know that there are places and people we can go to for help and support when we need it. God made us to be in relationship and community with each other. We need each other. And that's what grace is supposed to convey to us. But when we have been captured by a shame-based system, those needs are not met the way that they should be. This whole concept of a grace-based or shame-based system is on a continuum. It's not an either or. It's not you're either this end or this end. We're all on it somewhere. Our journey is to learn about this, recognize the stumbling blocks, get them out of the way, and move toward this grace-based system. Learning where we are can help us recognize what those stumbling blocks are that I mentioned and help guide us in the steps toward healing and wholeness. You know, we learn this shame-based system from the family that we grow up in. We also learn this grace-based system if we grow up in a grace-based family. But most of us have grown up in shame-based families to some degree or another. And it is multi-generational. Shame gets passed on from generation to generation until somebody finally recognizes it, notices what's going on, and says, wait, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to find a better way. And that's when healing can begin, and when we can begin to discover who is love. God is love, and we can discover his goodness, and that he's good all the time. So, as I'm wrapping up here tonight, I want to look at some of the kinds of things, the stumbling blocks, okay, that identify whether or not we're living within a shame-based perspective. Again, I think we need to have the knowledge. We need to be able to know, what are these stumbling blocks I'm talking about? So, when we are shame-based, we will deal with it in two ways, just as the brothers in our parable did. Number one, we will act it out. When we are shame-based, we will act it out. And we will do that by having a very self-centered perspective sometime, where we focus just on ourselves and our own needs and we shut everybody else out. That's based on fear. We shut them out because we're afraid that if they know us, they'd reject us. So we shut people out. By having difficulty relating to other people, not tuning in to what's going on with other people, what they're feeling, or how their behavior affects somebody else. A lack of empathy by criminal, victimizing behaviors. And that ranges from breaking the law to abusing others, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And it all creates an alienation from the self, not connected to its own inner workings or what's going on there, lack of insight. We think of some of the situations we've seen in our country, some of the profiles that we've seen of some of the active shooters in school, some of the young men in schools and kind of thing. You'll see these kinds of dynamics in their lives if you were to study them. A second way to deal with being shame-based is that we'll try to act shameless and pass it on to others through different ways or different styles of doing that. The original acting shameless was in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3:11 and 12. And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat?" And the man said, "The woman whom you gave me with me, she gave me of the tree and I ate." So the first step was they tried to hide. The second step was the blaming and then attacking. He actually said, "You gave her to me. It's your fault, God." And we've been doing the same thing ever since. People have tried to act shameless and pass that on to others by adopting styles of shamelessness, which serve to do several things. Help them deny their own shame and pass it on to others. See, if we recognize something's not right and we're in that shame-based system, we don't want to admit it. We don't want to go, "Hey, I'm feeling really shame-based right now." We don't want to admit that. So we find a lot of ways to try to pass it on to other people. And there are many different styles of the way that we do that. Number one is perfectionism. Perfectionists never know how much is enough. And the belief here is my value comes from my production. What I do is what I am. And how much I do determines my worth. In other words, the more that I do, the better person I am. And that's the basis of that. And we become human doings instead of human beings. And the results here are a lot of judging and comparing, criticizing other people, competition. Another way is striving for control and power. The belief here is I can't allow myself to feel vulnerable or I will be ashamed. So to be out of control makes me feel vulnerable, therefore I must be in control. and having power gives me control. Therefore, I must have power. And so it's a way of not wanting to admit or feel that kind of thing. So it's a striving for power and control, and that wears many different faces. Some of the obvious ways, of course, are money and power and position and authority. But some of the less obvious ways of doing that are ways that we manipulate other people, using aggressiveness, anger, or tears, rage, abuse, manipulating other people. And the result of that is a lack of intimacy. You can't be intimate or close to somebody in a situation like that. You cannot share freely with anyone in a relationship unless there is equality. Another one, raging or anger, can be a cover-up for shame. The belief here is that anger will protect me by keeping others away and by transferring shame to them. Being angry and shaming at other people protects by keeping people from getting close. And there is rage that's turned against the self. Suicide, cutting, burning, those kinds of things. And the result here is raging isn't just about yelling and screaming. There are other ways of doing that. Becoming bitter, sarcastic, hostile, developing a biting, sarcastic kind of humor, picking on other people. It's, I'm just kidding, why can't you take it kind of thing. That can be a sign of some of that raging or that anger that's not being addressed. See, the truth is God, I think I said this before, but God gives us our feelings as signals. It's a signal that's supposed to come in and give us some information about the state of our life or our relationships at the time. So the feeling comes in, let's say it's anger, the feeling comes in, angry, okay, something's happened here, boundaries been violated or something like that, I need to do something about it, I can do something about it, and then the feeling goes on. Where we get ourselves in trouble is when the feeling comes in and we don't deal with it and don't address it, and it gets stuck. And that's when we begin to act it out against other people in all kinds of ways. Another way of acting shameless is arrogance, an exaggerated sense of our own importance. The world does revolve around me, you know. And that creates victims by putting others in a one-down position so you can feel better about yourself. When I was in graduate school, I worked in the International Student Office, and we had a woman in our the admitting office who handled transcripts and all the students coming in. What I noticed consistently with her, with all of the foreign students from other countries, is that she had such an ugly, critical attitude toward them that it just was such a pattern. Anybody from another culture was not okay. And so she created that kind of one-up, down kind of relationship with people. And she was trying to act out her own shame. That was about her and not the other people. Another way is criticizing and blaming. We pass on our own feelings of being put down and humiliating by criticizing and blaming other people. If I can whittle you down to my size, then I'll feel better. And that's kind of the perspective here. Children are especially vulnerable to this in growing up in a household where parents are doing this kind of thing. Then we have judgmentalism and moralizing. We look to feel better about ourselves by judging or finding fault with other people. We point out how sinful everybody else is, and we condemn others as bad, and the result is we get to feel righteous and one up. So it's about putting other people down so we can feel better about ourselves. Another one is contempt. Rejecting other people by feeling contempt for them. That can be directed toward ourselves or other people. Patronizing, another way to feel one up. Treating others in a condescending way that shames them. People-pleasing and being nice. The key here is to look at the goal and the motivation. The goal of a nice person is their own image and not really the welfare of the other person. It's being nice at the cost of being real. And that's kind of a way of manipulating people and other people in situations too, and a way of avoiding real emotional contact and intimacy with people. And the result of that is that resentment builds up, anger builds up, envy, that green-eyed feeling, they call it, when somebody else achieves or gets something and you don't. That comes out in belittling, criticizing, fault-finding. And that ranges from the very obvious to the subtle here. But when a shame-based person sees somebody else succeed, they critically evaluate themselves and always see themselves as lacking because it's about that comparison. And the last one here is compulsions and addictions. Reaching for relief for that intolerable pain of being hopelessly defective, because that's what's happened when we're shame-based. We think we're hopelessly defective, and we need relief for that. That becomes a way of life, trying to find relief from that feeling. And there are many ways that we do that to alter our mood and the way we feel, and every one of them is potentially addictive. Anything that we do, we don't like how we feel, we do something to change that has the potential of being addictive. And if the way that we choose to alter our mood takes away that gnawing discomfort that we have, then that will become our highest priority. We can be addicted to chemicals that we take in. We can be addicted to feelings such as rage, sadness, fear. We can be addicted to mental obsessions, to activities like pornography, exercise, eating, video games. There are lots of ways that we choose to change how we feel. We have a legitimate need, but many times we try to fill it in an illegitimate way. And so you can see here the correlation, I hope, between that list of shame-based behaviors and our two brothers in the parable. And the way any of those behaviors cause stumbling blocks in our lives, in our relationship with God. Every one of those things can be stumbling blocks that get in our way. And how indeed we ourselves can be those two brothers in many different ways. So then we come back again to my original premise in this series, is that when we learn and know with all our hearts who Jesus really is, we can move out of that shame-based system into one that's based on His grace and His sovereign love and His goodness. We'll know that we don't have to prove. We'll know that we're not defective. We'll know that we have His love, and that's secure, and that empowers us to live in such a way that we can secure that intimacy with Him. That is our inheritance. So we can then learn how to recognize our true identity and live in that freedom of God's restoration. So when I have the opportunity to come back to the series, I want to talk about kind of how we can move into a place of healing from this shame and the things that bind us here. Because I believe without a doubt whatsoever that God's way gives us the hope that we need to move into a totally different, more fulfilling dimension. And you know, we don't even need to know all the steps. Those of us who like to have plans or recipes for things, we want to know all the steps. We want to know everything that needs to be done, but we don't need to know that. We do need to know some things, but we need to know what is our next step. And that's what I want to talk about next time that I have an opportunity to come up here and talk to you. I don't think it's fair just to talk about what's wrong without giving you an opportunity to know how to change that. Because God gives us every opportunity in the world to change that and to come to an understanding of him and a relationship with him that can totally transform us. And I believe that when we are the church that he says we can be, I don't mean just Hope Center, but yes, Hope Center too, that people will be drawn to us. That's what we need to portray to people, is that kind of love and that kind of transformation in our lives, in our hearts, that allows us to reach out and live the gospel, not defend it, not say, well, this verse says that and that verse says that, why don't you see it? We will live it. And that's what will make the difference in this world.